You never really think something as simple as keeping a few chickens in your own backyard could turn into a full-blown neighborhood battle until it happens to you. It all started when my wife and I decided that having fresh eggs right from our own yard would be healthier, cleaner, and far more satisfying than buying them from the store. We had space, we had the time, and we loved the idea of knowing exactly where our food was coming from. A couple of hens clucking in the backyard seemed harmless. They weren't loud like a dog, they weren't messy like some other animals, and they weren't bothering anyone. Or so we thought. At first, everything was peaceful. The chickens were happy, the kids enjoyed collecting eggs in the mornings, and even the neighbors who noticed gave us a smile when they saw the little coop. But as you may know, in neighborhoods governed by HOAs, peace doesn't always last. One day, we got an official-looking envelope in the mail. I opened it, and my heart sank as I read the words. Notice of violation. Unauthorized animals on property. I remember sitting at the kitchen table with that paper in my hand thinking, really? Chickens? That's the big issue they want, to fight over? My wife walked in, read it over my shoulder, and simply shook her head with a smile that told me she wasn't going to let this slide. The HOA claimed that keeping chickens violated some obscure section of the neighborhood bylaws, even though those rules never specifically mentioned chickens at all. They were lumping them in with livestock, which made no sense, because our neighborhood was semi-rural. People had gardens, some had small sheds, and plenty of people had barking dogs that made far more noise than our hens ever did. This wasn't about noise or cleanliness. It felt like control. They didn't like the idea of someone doing something a little different, something they couldn't easily regulate. We decided not to react immediately. My wife, being calm and calculated, told me to relax and let her handle it. Now here's the part that the HOA probably didn't realize at the time. My wife isn't just any woman living quietly in the neighborhood. She's a state legislator. That's right. She helps write and pass laws that affect the entire state. And if there's one thing she knows how to do, it's stand up for what's right and challenge rules that are unfair. But she didn't tell them that right away. She wanted to see just how far they would go in trying to enforce this nonsense. Week later, we got another letter, this one more threatening. It said we had 10 days to remove the chickens or face fines of $100 per day until we complied. That's when my wife decided it was time to respond. She sat down at her desk, pulled out her laptop, and drafted a carefully worded letter. She cited state statutes, agricultural exemptions, and even recent legal cases that supported backyard chickens as a homeowner's right. She ended the letter by requesting a formal meeting with the HOA board to discuss the matter further. I watched her type it all out with a quiet confidence that honestly made me smile. But here's where the story takes a turn. Before the meeting ever happened, word started spreading in the neighborhood. Some people came up to us quietly and said, they supported us. They liked the idea of chickens, they wanted fresh eggs too, and they felt the HOA had been overreaching in other areas as well. It was like our small chicken issue had tapped into something bigger. People were tired of being told what they could and couldn't do on their own property. The night of the HOA meeting came, and I'll never forget the look on the faces of the board members when my wife walked into the room. They knew her, of course, but I don't think they fully appreciated what it meant until that moment. She sat calmly, waited her turn, and when she spoke, the entire room went silent. She explained how the rule they were trying to enforce was vague, how chickens did not constitute livestock under state law, and how families across the state were being encouraged to keep small backyard flocks for food security and sustainability. She even mentioned bills she had worked on that supported local farming initiatives. By the time she was done, the board members looked like they had bitten into a sour lemon. But here's the hook that kept everyone in that room leaning forward. She didn't stop with just the chickens. She told them, in no uncertain terms, that if the HOA continued down this path of overreach, She was more than willing to draft legislation at the state level that would make it explicitly illegal for HOAs to ban backyard chickens anywhere in the state. You could practically hear the collective gasp. It wasn't just about us anymore. It was about setting a precedent that would strip HOAs of that power altogether. The tension in the room was thick. Some neighbors broke into quiet applause, while others just looked shocked. The board members tried to argue back, but they didn't have the same command of the law or the confidence to match her. She had them cornered, and they knew it. Instead of backing down gracefully, they stalled. They said they'd review the matter and get back to us. But by then, the story had spread even further. Neighbors were talking about it, local news. Outlets started sniffing around, and what began as a small HOA dispute was turning into a community debate about rights, property, and fairness. In the days that followed, our mailbox filled with letters of support. People we barely knew dropped off notes saying they admired my wife for standing up, that they were tired of being pushed around, and that they hoped this would lead to bigger changes. It was inspiring to see how something as small as a chicken cup could ignite a spark of resistance against unnecessary control, and yet the HOA wasn't ready to give up. They started sending passive-aggressive notices about unrelated things, our grass being too tall even though it wasn't, or our trash cans being too visible even though they were right where everyone else's were. It was petty, but it showed they were rattled. They knew they had picked the wrong fight, and now they were scrambling to regain control. That's when my wife decided to play her final card. She scheduled a town hall-style meeting, open to all residents, where she promised to explain not just our chicken situation, but also the larger issue of HOA overreach. Flyers went out, people showed up in droves, and the turnout shocked even us. The room was packed with families, seniors, young couples, and folks who had their own grievances with the HOA. Everyone was ready to listen, and my wife knew exactly how to hold their attention. She told the story from the beginning, our quiet little flock, the first violation notice, the threats of fines, and then she widened the lens. She explained how this wasn't about chickens at all. It was about homeowners being stripped of their freedom to live reasonably on their own property. She spoke passionately about the need for balance, fairness, and respect between HOAs and residents. By the end, the room was buzzing with energy. People were nodding, clapping, even standing up to voice their own frustrations, and that's when it hit me. This wasn't just our fight anymore. It had become everyone's fight, and that gave us more strength than any notice, fine, or petty rule could ever take away. After that town hall meeting, it became clear that the HOA had seriously underestimated what they had stepped into. What they thought would be a simple enforcement of their so-called rules had now exploded into something far bigger than they could control. Neighbors were united in a way I had never seen before. For years, people had quietly grumbled about the HOA's nitpicking. Letters about paint colors, mailboxes being an inch too tall, or holiday decorations being taken down too late. But most folks just swallowed their frustration and went along with it. Now, with my wife standing up and giving them a voice, the silence had broken. The days that followed were a whirlwind. The HOA board tried to regain control by holding their own emergency meeting, but this time, hardly anyone attended. People were losing trust, and when the board sent out a newsletter doubling down on their claim that livestock of any kind, including poultry, is strictly prohibited, it backfired. Neighbors laughed at it, pointing out the irony of them focusing on chickens while real issues, like road repairs or neighborhood safety, went ignored. Meanwhile, our chickens went on, clucking happily in the backyard, completely unaware of the storm they had started. Each morning, when my kids went out to collect eggs, I couldn't help but smile. Those little eggs had become more than food. They were a symbol of defiance, of freedom, of not letting yourself get bullied by a group of people hiding behind fine print. But the HOA wasn't done. One afternoon, I came home to find a bright orange notice taped to our front door. This one wasn't just a threat of fines, it was a notice of intent to take legal action. My stomach dropped as I read the words. They were actually considering suing us over chickens. Chickens! I carried the paper into the kitchen and laid it on the counter. My wife read it once, then set it down slowly. She didn't look scared. In fact, she almost looked energized. She knew this was the move they would regret the most. That night, we sat around the dinner table, the kids asking if we would really have to get rid of their hens. My wife leaned in, looked them straight in the eyes, and said, "No one is taking away our chickens." The confidence in her voice was enough to ease their worries. And mine too. Because when my wife made a promise, she kept it. The next morning, she made a few phone calls. She reached out to a couple of colleagues from the legislature, explained what was happening, and asked for their thoughts. To our surprise, she wasn't the only lawmaker who had heard complaints about HOA overreach. In fact, one of her colleagues admitted they had been looking for a good case to highlight just how out of control some associations had become. My wife's situation was the perfect storm: a relatable family, a harmless activity, and an HOA, determined to push too far. Within a week, a local reporter reached out wanting to do a story. At first, I was hesitant. I didn't want cameras at our house or our neighbors dragged into drama they hadn't asked for. But my wife saw it differently. She said, "If they want to make this a public fight, then let's make it public. Let's shine a light on it." So, we agreed. The news crew came, filmed the chickens pecking around in the yard, interviewed us about the letters and fines, and even got a comment from some supportive neighbors. When the segment aired, the reaction was overwhelming. People from all across the state sent messages of support. Some shared their own stories of battling unreasonable HOAs, from garden gnomes being banned to kids' bicycles not being allowed on driveways. The chickens had become a symbol for something much bigger, and my wife was right at the center of it. But of course, the HOA didn't like that attention one bit. They released a stiff statement saying they were simply enforcing community standards and that they valued harmony. But anyone who had been paying attention could see right through it. The more they pushed, the more foolish they looked. Still, they weren't ready to back down. One afternoon, a man in a suit showed up at our door. He introduced himself as the HOA's attorney and handed us a packet of legal documents. They were officially filing a lawsuit to force us to remove the chickens and pay back fines. I'll admit, my hands shook a little as I flipped through the papers. Lawsuits are no joke. But once again, my wife was calm. She told me, "This is exactly the mistake I was hoping they'd make." You see, in their arrogance, the HOA had given her the perfect opening. A lawsuit meant everything was now on public record. It meant she could bring in not just her legal knowledge, but her political influence. And it meant the fight had moved out of their tiny meeting room and into a courtroom where their vague, petty rules would be tested against actual law. The hook came when she told me her plan. She wasn't just going to fight the lawsuit, she was going to countersue. She would argue that the HOA's actions were not only baseless, but also harassment, intentionally designed to intimidate us and strip us of reasonable property rights. And with all the media attention already building, she knew the HOA would be walking straight into a storm. The first hearing was packed. Neighbors came to show support, holding signs outside that said things like, "Let them keep their chickens," and "Property rights matter." Reporters filled the benches, cameras waited outside, and suddenly, what had started as a backyard hobby had turned into one of the most watched local cases of the year. Inside the courtroom, the HOA's lawyer tried to argue that chickens were livestock and that our neighborhood was not zoned for farming. But my wife stood up, her voice steady and commanding, and dismantled his argument piece by piece. She showed photos of our quiet little coop, cited state law that specifically differentiated small flocks from livestock, and even referenced city ordinances in nearby areas that encouraged backyard hens for sustainability. She spoke with authority, not just as a homeowner defending her family, but as a legislator who understood the broader implications. The judge listened carefully, nodding at her points, occasionally raising an eyebrow at the HOA's flimsy arguments. By the time the session ended, it was clear to everyone in the room that the HOA was in over its head. But instead of ruling right then and there, the judge scheduled a continuation. It wasn't over yet, but the momentum was shifting. When we walked out of that courthouse, people cheered. Neighbors we had barely spoken to hugged us, shook our hands, and told us to keep fighting. My wife smiled, thanked them, and promised she wasn't backing down. And in that moment, I realized this was no longer just about us keeping a few chickens. It was about drawing a line in the sand, about proving that ordinary families didn't have to bow down to unreasonable power. The HOA fight wasn't finished, though. The HOA still had cards to play, and the next round was going to get even uglier. The tension in the air was thick as the final hearing approached. The HOA had done everything in their power to turn the neighborhood against us, painting wild pictures of chaos if families were allowed to keep something as harmless as a few hens. They claimed property values would crash, that noise would ruin everyone's peace, and that soon people would be demanding goats and pigs in their backyards. It was dramatic, exaggerated, and completely detached from reality, but it showed just how desperate they were. By now, the story had spread far beyond our street. Local newspapers had given it catchy headlines, radio stations debated it, and neighbors from across town began showing up at meetings to watch the drama unfold. Strangers approached me in grocery stores just to say they were rooting for us. It was no longer just about a family with chickens. It had become a symbol of standing up to controlling power. But the pressure was real. Some of the HOA members resorted to intimidation, leaving anonymous letters in our mailbox, calling us selfish, telling us to move away if we wanted chickens. My kids felt shaken at first, but my wife explained it in a way that made sense. When people feel their control slipping, they lash out. That's a sign we're winning. She carried herself with calm certainty, and her resolve gave me strength, too. When the day of the hearing finally arrived, the courtroom was packed even more than before. The HOA sat together in stiff suits, their lawyer trying to look confident, but clearly nervous. My wife walked in with quiet confidence, carrying nothing but her folder of documents and letters of support. The atmosphere was electric. Everyone knew this decision would matter for more than just us. The HOA's lawyer tried again, this time claiming that our chickens were a nuisance. He said they were noisy, that they smelled, that neighbors couldn't enjoy their yards because of them. He even called a board member to testify, but under questioning, it came out that he lived 3 streets away. The courtroom chuckled, and even the judge looked unimpressed. Then my wife presented her side. She had gathered letters from a dozen immediate neighbors who supported us completely. Some wrote about how their children loved learning from our hens. Others described how the chickens reduced bugs in their yards. An older woman said the sound of hens clucking reminded her of her childhood and brought her joy. Each testimony painted a picture of community, not conflict. When my wife gave her closing remarks, her voice carried with calm conviction. She explained this wasn't about chickens alone. It was about fairness, about property rights, about whether a small group of people could dictate how everyone else lived without cause. She wasn't fiery or angry. She was steady and persuasive. And as I looked around, I saw jurors nodding, neighbors listening intently, even strangers leaning forward in agreement. The judge finally spoke, and the room held its breath. He began by acknowledging that HOAs have a role in keeping order, but he said that in this case the board had failed to show any real harm caused by our hens. Their rules were vague, their enforcement selective, and their actions heavy-handed. Then came the words we had been waiting for. We had the right to keep our chickens. The room erupted in applause. People clapped, neighbors cheered, and my wife turned toward me with a smile that said everything: relief, victory, and quiet triumph. But the surprise wasn't over. The judge also addressed my wife's countersuit. He ruled that the HOA had crossed into harassment and ordered them to pay our legal fees and issue a formal apology. The faces of the board members turned pale as the reality of their defeat sank in. Outside, reporters swarmed, asking how it felt to win. My wife, always measured, simply said, "This wasn't just about us. It was about protecting fairness. No one should have to fight this hard just to keep a few chickens." Her words struck a chord, and the story spread even further. People across the state began talking about HOA reform. Lawmakers even started drafting bills to limit the reach of HOAs, ensuring ordinary families had more say in their own homes. At home, life returned to normal. The hens clucked happily in their coop. My kids gathered eggs with joy, and neighbors visited often, feeling connected rather than divided. The HOA, humbled, grew quieter. A few board members resigned, and new leadership promised a friendlier, more reasonable approach. Things would never be quite the same again, but in a good way. One evening, as we sat on the porch with the sunset glowing on the horizon, my wife leaned over and said, half joking, "I never thought chickens would be my biggest political victory." We both laughed, but she was right. What started as a neighborhood dispute had turned into a lesson for so many, that even small battles matter, that standing firm can change things, and that courage often begins in the most ordinary places. And that's the truth of it. This wasn't really a story about chickens. It was a story about refusing to back down when something is unfair. It was about showing that power can be challenged, even by regular people in their own backyards. And maybe, just maybe, it was about reminding everyone that change often begins not with grand speeches or sweeping movements, but with one simple act of courage that inspires others to do the same.